Hello and welcome to Identity Security on the Rails, Simple Solutions to Disrupt Identity-Based Attacks. Today's webinar is sponsored by SentinelOne and produced by Actual Tech Media. My name is Scott Becker. I'm from Actual Tech Media, and I'm excited to be your moderator for this special event. Now, before we get to today's great content, we do have a few housekeeping items that will help you get the most out of this session. First off, we want this to be an informative event for you, so we encourage any questions in the questions box in our webinar control panel. Not only will we have team members responding to questions during the live event, but we'll also have a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the presentation where we'll discuss in greater detail some of the top questions that you have. That Q&A panel is also the place to let us know about any technical issues that you might face. A browser refresh will fix most problems, but if you have other technical difficulties, just let us know in the chat and we'll help you out. Second, in the handout section of your webinar control panel, you'll find that we're offering several resources. I'd especially like to call your attention to 3 PDFs from SentinelOne. There's an identity security checklist. There is a document about how CISOs empower enterprises to develop robust identity security programs. And there's a document about introducing identity to your cybersecurity strategy. They're all great resources, and so I'd highly recommend that you access those resources now and share them with your friends and your colleagues. Third, at the end of this webinar event, we will be awarding a $300 Amazon gift card to one lucky registrant here right in time for the holiday season. Of course, you must be in attendance during the live event to qualify for that prize. Official terms and conditions of today's prize drawing can be found in the handout section. Just scroll to the bottom and you'll find the prize terms and conditions link there. Finally, one of the best benefits of this event is the opportunity to ask a question of our expert presenter. So to help encourage your questions, we have a special additional prize for you. That's another Amazon gift card, this one for $50 for the best question. So at the end of the event, we'll look at all the questions that came in, pick out the very best one, and contact that prize winner. But with that, let's get to today's fantastic presentation. So it's my pleasure to introduce you to our speaker today, Joseph Salazar, who's a technical marketing engineer at SentinelOne. Joseph, welcome.
Hello, how are you guys doing?
Great. Thanks for coming on. Yeah, take it away.
Sure, thank you very much. So today I want to talk about securing enterprises with enterprise identities with SentinelOne. I am a technical marketing engineer, but another title I have is identity security technologist. I've done a lot of identity-related security, and when I talk about identity-related security, I'm not talking about the typical solutions that you are thinking about. So, and I'll talk about that in a moment. These are the agenda topics. We're going to talk about identity-centric risks. Identity security, which is a relatively new branch of information technology security. And then we're going to talk about reducing the identity attack surface, limiting what the attackers can attack, reducing your identity-based risks, and then detecting identity-centric attacks. This is referring to a new category of controls called identity threat detection and response. And then we'll talk a bit about identity as part of an overall security strategy as shown in an XDR solution. So let's dive right in. These tweets came out shortly after the Conti database leak. For those of you who don't know, Conti is a ransomware. The database was accessed by security researchers and leaked out to the community earlier this year. And several people chimed in on what they saw. And interestingly enough, there is a relatively common theme when it came to what they were focusing on, and that's Active Directory. So Active Directory is the most used identity management solution. 90% of Fortune 1000 companies globally use Active Directory to manage their identities within the enterprise. And attackers know this, so it has also become the most attacked resource in an enterprise environment. For the past 5, 7, maybe even 10 years, Active Directory has been actively targeted. Attackers have created different ways to attack it. And because it is the primary source of identity management within an enterprise, it leaves a gaping hole in your identity security. Interestingly enough, Mandiant Vice President Nick Bennett, when he was discussing recent ransomware attacks, said that basically in virtually every single significant ransomware case, and by recent I mean in the last 5 to 7 years, the attacker took advantage of something in the victim's AD. So it's obvious that attackers, and ransomware attackers and other attackers are targeting Active Directory. So let's talk a little bit about identity security and the challenges that make it difficult. So 84% of organizations, according to the Identity Security Alliance's recent survey, 84% of the respondents said that they had experienced an identity-related breach, and of those, 78% experienced a direct business impact because of that identity-related breach. That's a lot. And so it's obvious that attackers are targeting identities, and because there are so many organizations that don't secure identities well, they have a green field. $4.5 million is the average cost of a data breach attributed to a compromised credential, whether stolen or otherwise. $4.5 million is just the cleanup. This is not including the damages associated with it. This is just the cleanup. So, why is it so hard? Well, first, let's talk about the rapid enterprise identity expansion. Chances are, if you're running an Active Directory or any kind of IAM solution, you have anywhere between 3 and 5 times as many user identities as you have actual users. So think about it. You've got users with multiple accounts, multiple credentials, multiple user objects. You also have service accounts, application accounts. You've got device accounts, right? So what you think of as Active Directory isn't just limited to your users. It's all of the identities associated with that and all of those objects. And so your identity attack surface is massive. It's bigger than the number of users you actually have. And counting and that does not include the cloud. So for those of you who are using Azure Active Directory or another cloud-based IAM solution, those identities are also exposed. And speaking of cloud, you have cloud environment vulnerabilities. When we're talking about cloud environment vulnerabilities, not only are we talking about Azure Active Directory and other cloud IAM, we're talking about over-provisioned entitlements, right? The last estimate is that there are over 7,000 entitlements available in AWS, and 95% of users use less than 2 to 3% of the entitlements they're assigned, meaning that if an attacker compromises a cloud identity, they have way more access than you expect, right? And something as simple as getting access to a database gives them opportunity to exploit all of that data. And there are a lot of instances where a cloud identity has enterprise-based rights because, again, it's a common use identity. A user may only have one identity, and that is valid for both their enterprise and their cloud environment. Attackers using advanced techniques. So when I talk about advanced techniques, I'm talking about techniques that are very difficult to detect. We're talking about golden ticket attacks, silver ticket attacks, pass the hash, overpass the hash, DC sync, DC shadow, AS rep roasting, skeleton key attacks. These are all attacks that are extremely difficult for regular traditional defenses to detect. And they also have something else in common. Most of them are identity-based attacks because it's easier for an attacker to pretend to be a valid user than it is for them to take advantage of a weakness in a piece of software or to break into to a system using 0 days and unpatched vulnerabilities. If they can if they can steal a real production credential and use that credential, most of the hard work is already done. They have access to everything that user has access to. And then they can use advanced techniques to escalate those privileges so they can have more access. Poor identity security hygiene. When I talk about this, I'm talking about the misconfigurations, settings, and policies that are within your Active Directory or IAM, identity management solution, that leave it vulnerable to attack. Chances are, if you are in an unregulated industry like healthcare or finance, who gets audits, who do audits on their Active Directory periodically, you haven't done an assessment or an audit in your Active Directory in the past 5 years, according to statistics. And if you consider how long your Active Directory has been around and how many legacy settings should have been removed a long time ago, you know that there are probably a lot of vulnerabilities within your Active Directory. And there are also issues with users storing credentials at endpoints. You have users that will store credentials in their keychain, in their Windows Credential Manager, or in an application like your browser or a FTP client or an SSH client, right? Things they're not supposed to do because it's bad policy, but they'll do it because it's easier than having to remember multiple passwords. Or what about deactivated MFA or poorly implemented MFA, right? These poor identity security hygiene issues leave you vulnerable to attack for identity-based attacks. And then finally, you have privileged identity management issues, right? For those of you that run a PAM, and according to statistics, not everyone runs a PAM, and actually it's less than 50% of organizations actually run a PAM, a privileged access management solution. For those of you who run a PAM, even if you run a PAM, chances are you don't have all of your privileged users in that PAM, because there are things like that are called delegated users or shadow admins, users with admin-like privileges who don't necessarily belong to an administrative or a privileged group within Active Directory or your IAM. So they may not belong to a domain admins group, but they have rights to reactivate a locked account or change a password. So if I can, as a user, as an attacker, get change password permissions, I can change a service account and have service account level permissions. Or if I gain access to a user that can reactivate a locked account, I can reactivate a dormant domain admin account, and now I have domain admin rights. So all of these things, it's multiple different things that sort of overlap and cascade and make it very difficult to secure identities. So I mentioned this previously. Traditional defenses don't protect identities. And when I'm talking about identities, we are talking about credentials, privileges, and the systems that manage them like Active Directory, right? So generally you have two solutions that will touch on identities. You have your endpoint protection and your access protection, right? In your endpoints, you have things that look for malicious binaries, right? It's things designed to prevent credential misuse and lateral movement. So they can look for binaries like mimikatz or things of that nature that will look for activities that could be used as part of lateral movement, right? Whether it's a binary or other weird activity. And then you have access protection. This is access management. It's designed to ensure least privileges and entitlements. It's really designed to authenticate and authorize the appropriate users so they have access to what they need and not anything more. And you want to limit that with that least privileges policy, right? But none of these actually protect the credentials or the credential management systems, the identity management system. And for that, you need identity security. Identity security is designed for continuous awareness and attack detection for identity-based attacks, right? You want to be aware of the exposures and vulnerabilities within your credential identity environment, right? Whether it's an Active Directory or at the endpoints, and you want to detect identity-based attacks as they happen in near real time so that you can stop them, because the longer an attacker has to leverage identities, the more access they can get and the more damage they can do. So let's look at what identity protection landscape looks like right now, right? IGA, IAM, and PAM, Identity Governance Administration, Identity Access Management, and Privileged Access Management. These are the things that people normally think about when they talk about identity protection, right? So IGA is designed to manage and govern identities. This is designed to provision identities and provide an audit trail so that you can govern those identities and the privileges and show that you are meeting compliance requirements. You have IAM, which is designed to authenticate and authorize identities, right, like Active Directory. And then you have PAM, which is designed to protect a subset of identities, but none of these actually protect the identities and identity management systems. They protect access, right? None of this says that they can stop credential theft that will lead to lateral movement, or they can stop privilege escalation, or they can detect and stop identity-based attacks. Access security doesn't do that. Identity security does that. Now, identity security is really broken down into two things. Identity attack surface management, which is designed to manage and reduce your identity attack surface and your identity-related risks. And then identity threat detection and response, which is designed to detect identity-based attacks and defend identities in real time or near real time, right? So credential theft, attacks that target identities. And we'll get into more of that. So let's use an example how ransomware can leverage identity-based attacks and use Active Directory to actually spread into your environment, right? So I, as an attacker, have two ways to gain access, to an environment. So generally, most users have some sort of remote access, right? Either because of remote work or because they have to, if they travel, they have to be able to access the enterprise network. And so, well, for one way is to send phishing emails or malicious emails with attachments or links that will get my payload down to that user, and then from there I can utilize those advanced attack techniques to steal credentials and gain access. Or I'll just use social engineering. Hey, this is your IT department. I just sent you an attachment. This is a patch. We've been actively attacked by a 0-day in our environment, and I need you to run this patch to make sure that your system is immune to these attacks. Now that I've got a foothold, I can steal credentials, right? And I can use those credentials. I'm particularly looking for RDP or VPN or other remote access credentials that will give me access to the internal environment. Or I'll just utilize whatever access I have and target common vulnerabilities in that VPN server or the RDP server. And then from there, once I have access to the internal network, I'm going to move around and steal identities. I've already stolen the identities of that remote user, so I know that user is valid. I'm going to use those identities to try to look at other systems. I'm going to move laterally. I'm going to escalate privileges. I'm going to add persistence mechanisms. I'm going to use like Kerberos Sting or Mimikatz or brute force or a DC sync or a DC shadow attack to gain, and these are all identity-based attacks, and I will use that to gain access to elevated privileges or your Active Directory. Because once I get to your Active Directory, I can do several things. One, I can create a GPO to distribute ransomware through your legitimate Active Directory channel. So that GPO will install my ransomware on every single system that logs on to your environment. And then two, I can encrypt your entire Active Directory and then charge you a ransom to decrypt it so you can get back up and running. And even further, I can exfiltrate that information and threaten to release it unless you pay me an even bigger ransom. And all of this happens because of identity-based attacks. So I ask you, what happens if we disrupt the attacker's ability to conduct reconnaissance, which is identity-based reconnaissance, exploit identities, and move laterally? You can stop their attack before it gets going. So identity security has several goals. The first is to reduce the attacker's opportunities to succeed. This is really attack surface management and risk reduction. The second part is to find attackers early before they exploit identities. This is where you want to detect attacks, identity-based attacks, as they happen. And then you want to engage attackers with lures and bait. So why would you give them real information when you can use deception tactics, which is what engaging attackers with lures and bait is, and then you want to make identity part of your overall security strategy. So let's look at these individual topics. So identity attack surface management. So this is designed to efficiently understand your exposures and attack paths from your endpoints to Active Directory and the cloud, right? When I talk about the cloud, I'm talking about things like Azure Active Directory. When I talk about Active Directory, that's on premises, and then of course you've got your endpoints where those users store those credentials they're not supposed to, right? So we want to reduce these identity-related risks. Exposed passwords. So these are passwords that are stored at endpoints. Or credential attack paths from the endpoint. So if I store a credential as a user and an attacker steals it, what do they get? They get a username, they get a password, and they get a network destination, right? Those are attack paths. So the more credentials that a user stores at the endpoint, the more attack paths they create within your environment that can allow an attacker to move laterally, right? And then I've already mentioned Active Directory exposures and vulnerabilities. So I'll give you some examples in a little bit, but what about accidentally leaving SMB version 1 active, right? SMB version 1 is vulnerable to attack. So in fact is SMB version 2, right? Suppose you had to create some exceptions to deploy an application, and then you forgot to remove those exceptions. Or a user gets added to a group they're not supposed to be part of, right? Those are all exposures within your Active Directory. And then, of course, you've got cloud exposures and entitlement over provisioning, because there are exposures and vulnerabilities within Azure Active Directory as well. And you have that over-entitlement, that entitlement over provisioning that I mentioned that will give attackers access to more than a user identity is actually using. So what are exposures? Well, exposures are defined as vulnerabilities that attackers are actively exploiting. Yes, these exposures that can be identified in Active Directory are actively exploited by attackers right now. There are over 200 different checks, and I'll talk about that in terms of what we do from SentinelOne standpoint. We do over 200 different checks, look at over 135 different vulnerabilities across on-premises AD and Azure Active Directory. And these are all exposures because they are being actively exploited by attackers, right? We have things like users with excessive permissions. Now, I mentioned users belonging to a group, but what about users belonging to access control lists, right? Because the way Active Directory works, every object has an access control list, right? Users can belong to access control lists for objects that give them access to change permissions on those objects, right? There's an object called admin SD holder that has an access control list. Admin SD holder governs all of the built-in groups and objects within Active Directory, like the domain admin group. So a user that has access or is a part of the admin SD holder ACL can change the access control list and add anybody they want to the domain admin group, right? Things like that. Administrators with non-expiring or simple passwords. We've seen this several times. It happens, right? You have an admin who created a password that doesn't conform to group policies or password policies, or they stop them from expiring because they're tired of having to reset them every 30, 60, or 90 days. Or users that do not require passwords. Now you ask, well, what about that? Well, there are applications that have accounts. These accounts may not have interactive logins. So some admins will set them to not require a password to log on to a system, right? Accounts or users that can replicate the AE database, right? This leaves you open to a DC sync or a DC shadow attack, right? Where I can replicate or set up a fake Active Directory, make changes to the database, and then upload that, and that gets mirrored on your real Active Directory. Or I can mirror your Active Directory database, do offline attacks against it, and pull out the hashes, and now have access to all of the passwords for your admin group. Scripts with hard-coded credentials. How many of you heard about GitHub repositories where someone created code with a hard-coded password and then it ends up getting uploaded to GitHub? Well, this happens with scripts too, right? A developer or an admin does some testing and hard codes the script with a credential and then forgets to remove it, right? Dormant domain admin accounts, I mentioned that before, right? Where you have a user or domain admin that goes on leave or leaves and they deactivate the account, right? Instead of actually deleting it, and then an attacker comes along and reactivates it. Or accounts in, user accounts in privileged groups. All of these are exposures. Identity exposures at the endpoints. We talked about this a little bit. Stored AD administrative credentials. Again, users will store credentials. Deactivated MFA, orphaned or duplicate credentials, and then, of course, the delegated admins. All of these can exist at the endpoints. So we have what's called Ranger AD. Ranger AD is an assessment and monitoring solution that will assess your Active Directory and then continuously monitor it for changes that can reveal additional exposures, right? We do over 200 checks to address about 135 to identify and address over about 135 different exposures. We have automated remediation for a set of those exposures, and we can remediate we provide the remediation steps for those that require manual intervention, right? And we'll give you all of this information and provide a top-level view as well as a per exposure view. In fact, this is an exposure for a weak Kerberos ticket granting ticket account that leaves them open to a golden ticket attack. We give you all of the references. We give you the mitigation steps. We give you the associated TTPs and all of the references associated with it. So rich details for each one of the 135 or so different exposures that we identify. We can also detect attacks that show up within the Active Directory database. For example, this particular attack is an attacker creating an application group, application group membership, adding a domain, an AD admin or a user to an application group. That is an identity-based attack for Azure Active Directory, right? Or creating a new service account within the Active Directory, right? These are identity-based attacks that you can only detect if you're monitoring the Active Directory, which is what we do. So now let's talk about detecting these attacks, right? This is ITDR, Identity Threat Detection and Response. It's a new category of security controls brought up by Gartner. This is designed to detect identity-based attacks to protect identities and the systems that manage them, right? So this is things like identity credential misuse, privilege escalation, and lateral movement. So credential theft, right? Privilege escalation, Active Directory reconnaissance. Now, Active Directory reconnaissance is an attack that happens during the recon phase. It is intelligence gathering, right? An attacker can query Active Directory from any domain join system without any additional tools because all these commands are built into every Windows endpoint, right? Things like the net user account or the NL test utility. Give it particular flags and it will come up and give you all the data that you need. So for example, if I type net space user, quote unquote, domain admins, space / domain, I'm going to get a list of all of domain administrators in your Active Directory. If I type nltest / dc list, I'm going to get a list of all the domain controllers, the Active Directory domain controllers in your environment. Now, I have targets, I have privileged user lists, and I've got a lot of what I need to do privilege escalation and get domain dominance in your domain. And that's all with just built-in queries. The thing about ITDR solutions is that they work with your existing solutions. This is not a rip and replace technology, right? This is designed to cover the gap that traditional solutions have regarding identity-based attacks. Now, I'm not saying that traditional solutions can't detect identity-based attacks. They can detect some. They'll detect a subset, but ITDR solutions are designed to detect more. And so they are ideally suited to cover that detection gap that exists within your security infrastructure. So they'll work with your MFA and SSO solutions. They will complement your existing solutions, your EPP, your EDR, your NDR, your XDR, to provide coverage to identity-based attacks. So this is meant to augment, not replace existing solutions. So let's talk about detecting live Active Directory attacks, right? So we can see and respond to domain controller attacks like golden ticket attacks, silver ticket attacks, DC sync, DC shadow, pass the ticket, pass the hash, right? Recon of privileged accounts. So these have two things in common. They're hard to detect and they're all identity-based attacks, right? Who's heard of an AS rep roasting attack or a forged pack or a skeleton key attack? These are obscure. These are things that the attacker uses, but most domain admins don't know to look for. And yet, ITDR solutions will detect these and many other attacks that are all identity-based. So let's talk a little bit about how our technology can do it, right? So we have two different ways to do this. We can detect it from the endpoints or we can detect it from the domain controller, right? So endpoint AD attack detection and misdirection. And here is the critical difference between us and other ITDR solutions. So we will hide and protect critical objects. So we will prevent the attacker from actually seeing credential objects both on the endpoints and within Active Directory, right? So if they look for these things, and this does sound like deception because it is, we're using deception as a tactic, we will actually conceal sensitive or privileged AD and local information that is identity-based data, right? And we'll return decoy data in their place. So, for example, if an attacker attempts to steal a credential from a user on an endpoint that's stored there, we can actually seed that endpoint with decoy credentials and hide the real credentials. Or they try to steal a stored credential from the browser. We can actually prevent that attacker. We can conceal that browser credential store and prevent the attacker from actually seeing those credentials in that storage. And we can provide fake data if they, say, run an AD query. We can actually hide the query results and provide decoy data in its place. And that decoy data can steer attackers to decoys. If you decide to use a deception technology solution, we'll actually steer that attacker to those decoys because that's where those decoy credentials and decoy AD results point to. And then you can provide intelligence by gathering everything that they do. And the cool part is that this will provide endpoint telemetry for visibility and hunting. It'll tell you all the commands that they run. It'll tell you what processes were responsible for any queries. It'll give you all of the information that you need from the endpoint. And then we have domain controller AD attack detection, right? This installs on domain controllers. It can detect attacks from any type of endpoint. Doesn't matter if it's Windows or Mac or IoT or Linux, doesn't matter. We'll detect attacks from any endpoint. We do this by looking at the types of queries that come. We'll inspect the data, we'll look at the event logs, and we'll look at the behavior to see if it actually is supposed to be doing that kind of stuff. This provides you protection with limited endpoint insight, so we won't see what's happening at the endpoint, but we'll let you know that a particular endpoint is attacking. And again, as I said, it employs deep packet inspection and analysis of AD logs. However, additionally, at least with our solution, we can provide conditional access for Active Directory by working with MFA providers that we partner with, such as Okta. So if we detect a suspicious or malicious activity, we can actually trigger MFA for reauthentication. If the user confirms it, we let it go through. If the user can't confirm it because it's an attacker, we stop that attack in its tracks because we deny access to that to the output of that activity. So deception's role in identity security, I mentioned this already. It is meant to derail identity-based attacks through concealment, misinformation, misdirection, and engagement. So my background, I spent 22 years in the military. I did retired from the reserves as a major. The first part of my career was counterintelligence. I was a counterintelligence agent, and then when I got my commission and became an officer, I worked in military intelligence for another 8 years of my career before finishing off in cybersecurity as a cybersecurity officer. So when we talk about counterintelligence, it's defined as defeating an adversary's ability to collect intelligence on you as an organization or an entity. So when you're talking about deception, deception is designed as a counterintelligence tactic to defeat intelligence gathering. And what is recon? Recon is intelligence gathering. So during the recon phase, the attacker is conducting intelligence gathering. So we use deception and deception tactics to defeat that intelligence gathering. Providing fake identity data is something that the identity solution, the identity threat detection and response solution can do, at least ours can, right? Those fake credentials, the fake Active Directory responses. But why would we provide them real data as well when we can conceal that real data? So deception is designed to also conceal the privileged identity data. I'm not going to give you a list of real domain admins. I'm going to give you a list of fake domain admins. Because even if you detect that attack, if they get the real information, they can still use it. So why would you give them that? And the idea here is that you're going to misdirect the attacks from production asset with bait and lures. And then, of course, if you set up a decoy system, right, you can point them to those decoys, and those decoys will gather intelligence on your adversary, turning the tables on them. So all in all, deception has a significant play, particularly with identity-based attacks. So our deception solution is Singularity Hologram. It is designed to automatically create an enterprise-wide deception fabric. It will profile all of your VLANs that it has access to. It will create decoys that will fit into those VLANs based on the services and operating systems that it sees in the profile. And that will automatically deploy them using live IP addresses that will assign to these decoys once you have approved of the deployment and the particular decoy makeup. It can even import golden images and create decoys out of them, and we can create application-specific decoys for your environment. Now, these decoys incorporate and integrate with the decoy credentials and the decoy Active Directory information automatically, so that if the attacker steals a credential or does an Active Directory query, these decoys will accept those connections, and you can even create an entirely fake Active Directory environment. So this technology came from an acquisition that SentinelOne made with a company called Ativo Networks. It was the leader in the deception space, according to every analyst within cybersecurity. It is the most comprehensive and most complete solution that you can find for deception. Not only does it handle endpoint and network, but it also handles cloud as well. So you can see all the different types of decoys that we can create, right? And we can even do cloud-specific technologies like serverless functions and storage buckets. So overall, the most complete identity deception-related solution. And it can collect forensics across multiple avenues. Not only can it collect forensics at the endpoint, it can also do full forensic capture of network memory and disk-based activity on every decoy. We can output any files that get dropped. We can output any PCAPs. We can give you reports, and we can do full analysis, and we can even integrate with your SIMs. So let's talk a little bit about why all this makes sense from a security standpoint. The goal of security is to detect attacks as early as possible so you can stop them before they really get rolling. We call that shifting detections left, finding and stopping the attacks sooner. So generally, most people have file-based detection, right? These are prevention mechanisms. This is your antivirus, your EPP. This is your EDR, maybe your XDR. These are designed to look for hashes or signatures for any malicious executables that show up on the endpoints, right? So someone drops Mimikatz on an endpoint, you're going to detect on it, that solution is going to detect on it, and it's going to throw up an alert. But we all know that file-based or signature-based detection isn't very accurate. You can bypass it or you can evade it. And so you add behavioral-based detection. This is things like UEBA or EDR or XDR, right? You're looking for user behavior or process behavior that doesn't make sense from a legitimate activity standpoint. So the way this works is your solution will create a baseline, right? And then it looks for deviations from that baseline. This is also called anomaly detection, right? That baseline has to be wide enough to allow normal or operational activities, but not so wide that it will identify deviations from that normal activity, right? So you're looking at a baseline and then boundaries you set above and below that baseline so that if the activity meets that or exceeds that threshold, it creates an alert. The problem is attackers know about UEBA, and so they can adjust their activities so that they don't go beyond particular baselines. They go beyond the deviations from that baseline, right? So they can be evaded. You can't evade behavioral-based detection, whether it's a process or user activity, right? But the goal here is to detect them, and using a combination of the two, you have pretty good coverage, right? It's not perfect, but it's pretty good. But now you want to do incident response, right? You want to respond to the attack as quickly as possible. So you're going to use some form of automation, right? Or you're going to have an IR team whose sole purpose is to respond to those alerts as quickly as possible, right? And so you'll do things like SOAR, or again, using XDR. You're going to try to automate these responses as quickly as possible, right? So the attacker doesn't get a chance to get rolling and the attack gets stopped early enough, right? So you've gotten the detection and now you're trying to do the response. And so you're going to stop a process from running. You're going to limit an account access, or you're going to quarantine an endpoint, right? But beyond that, you also want to ingest other telemetry from other partners that, that's not native to your XDR or SOAR solution, right? Because you want to coordinate other third-party responses, like the firewall. You want to create a firewall block to prevent that communications outbound to command and control. Or you want to add a proxy block. Or you've got internal firewalls for internal network segmentation, and you want to add blocks to prevent a fast-moving infection from spreading laterally in your environment, right? Things like that. But you also want to get all of this information because you want to get a clearer view of the actual full attack cycle. You want to get to root cause analysis, and you want to fix any issues that allowed that attack to happen in the first place. So here's the thing. All of these have one thing in common. They're post-execution. They're post-recon. They're post the attacker getting in and executing something. Because in order for a file to have been written to an endpoint, an initial compromise must have happened, right? Something must have happened. The attacker must have already gotten a chance to do recon. They might have already moved laterally before you've gotten to that fourth step, which was third-party responses to limit lateral movement. And this is where ITDR really shines. ITDR is identity-based recon and theft detection. This is detecting activities during the recon phase, earlier than any of the other solutions that are on this timeline, right? You are detecting attackers during reconnaissance, during credential theft, right? You're going to detect them as they attempt to move laterally, as they're attempting to query query Active Directory. All of this is happening before they've actually stepped off that endpoint and started moving laterally. This is the earliest opportunity for you to detect that attack. This is the furthest left you can go. And sometimes some people will say this is even pre-execution, before they've gotten past initial compromise, right after they've established a foothold. And the really cool part about all of this is that if you can use deception, misdirection, and engagement, you're starting from the recon phase to deceive them and misdirect them. And because you're pointing them to your decoy environment, you can get full engagement from the get-go. So the attack never actually gets off the ground. How powerful is that? So let's talk a little bit about the Sentinel-1 Singularity Identity Protection portfolio. First, we have Ranger AD. Ranger AD is our Active Directory assessment solution. It's designed to strengthen your Active Directory defenses and harden your on-premises Azure Active Directory. This addresses that security goal, the identity security goal of reducing the opportunities for attackers to succeed. The next part is Singularity Identity. This is our ITDR solution. It will detect and respond to identity-based attacks. It can defend identities both at workstations and domain controllers, and this is so that you can find attackers early before they actually have a chance to exploit the identities. Even further, this provides deception and misdirection as a tactic because it is concealing the credentials and privileged or sensitive AD objects at the endpoint and on the Active Directory domain controller. And it is providing decoy results in their place. So concealment and bait and lures. And then finally, we have our hologram, right? And as I mentioned, hologram has a play within the identity security environment because you can create decoys that enhances the identity deception you've created with Singularity Identity, right? A fake Active Directory environment that can validate the fake Active Directory information they've stolen. Fake systems and applications that these credentials, the bait that they've stolen, the fake credentials, point to themselves. So this is designed to create and manage your decoy assets and engage the attackers with lures and bait in your decoy environment so you can collect intelligence on them and their tactics, techniques, and procedures. So how does this fit into Singularity XDR? Well, Singularity XDR has three main legs to the tripod. The first is endpoints, and I'll go deeper into this in the next slide. We have endpoint protection. We are the market leader in EDR solutions, right? And so this is designed to protect your endpoints. It's going to automatically fix any issues, and it's going to detect everything easily. Then you have cloud. Cloud is designed to protect your workloads seamlessly, and it's going to protect any cloud no matter what. And then we have identity. Identity is designed to protect your identity infrastructure and your identity data. So credentials, privileges, and Active Directory. And that is all included as native components to XDR, right? No other solution, no other XDR solution provides you with native identity security functions, native identity security capabilities. And all of this gets wrapped up in our storyline, right? Why get multiple alerts for multiple activities within a single attack when you can get one alert that contains all the telemetry from all of these sources? So you're only getting one alert, but you're getting all the information anyway. So this helps keep everything precise. It makes your incident response and analysis easier. And then, of course, we can provide all the data. We ingest native data and third-party data that we can add to our storyline. So our third-party data ingest from our partners in our marketplace and everything else, that all goes within the storyline so you can see all of that telemetry and you can natively look at it and you can take action across your entire environment. In fact, Peter Firstbrook, who coined the term identity threat detection and response for Gartner, said that no XDR solution can call itself complete without identity threat detection and response as a native component. And as I said, we are the only one that provides it right now. So our Singularity XDR portfolio Endpoint is designed to secure any device. This is AI-powered prevention, detection, and response with automated remediation. It is a market-leading EDR, and it comes with self-healing cybersecurity properties. Next is cloud. This is designed to secure any cloud with AI-powered protection. It is considered a cloud workload protection platform, CWPP, so it's really designed to protect workloads like your Kubernetes and other workloads in the cloud, and it is designed for frictionless cloud deployment. But if you think about what I mentioned earlier about protecting Azure AD is a cloud component. So this is something from a cloud perspective that we provide that no other cloud solution does, and that is identity protection for the cloud. So identity is designed to secure any person. Is identity security and credential protection. It is a market-leading ITDR. We do more than any other ITDR solution currently on the market, and it will provide instant attack surface reduction for identity-based attacks by reducing your identity-related risks and reducing the vulnerabilities and explosions within your Active Directory. All of these three together compose our Singularity XDR solution, which is the most complete solution available right now. So let's revisit those identity security goals, right? You want to reduce the attacker's opportunities to succeed. You want to find attackers early before they exploit identities. You want to engage the advanced attackers with lures and bait. So now it makes sense to talk about deception there. And then you want to make identity security part of your security strategy. And so this is how we recommend this, right? Reduce the identity attack surface. So for us, that means Ranger AD. Protect the identity infrastructure. For SentinelOne, that's the Singularity Identity solution. Defend against in-network attacks and insider threats, so that's Singularity Hologram, and then converge into an XDR platform as part of your security solution, and so that's Singularity XDR. So that covers everything that I had. Are there any questions?
There are. Yeah. No, great presentation. Really, really interesting. We did have a bunch of questions come in from the audience. The first one we have here, Joseph, comes from Steve, who's wondering, how does SentinelOne enhance and support the Microsoft Privileged Access Enterprise Access model, formerly the tiering model?
So here's the thing that we have to differentiate, right? The tiering model, the Microsoft Privileged Access Enterprise Access model, doesn't protect the identities. It's protecting the access by limiting certain tiers to certain access levels, right? We don't do that. We enhance the identity security around that because we're protecting the credentials that get used for that access, right? So again, this is working in tandem. It's not meant to replace it. It's supporting that model by protecting the actual credentials that are used to get authorization and authentication within that model.
Okay, super. Next question comes from James, who's wondering, have hackers been able to exploit task accounts yet? What steps can be taken to protect the required task accounts in a system?
So yes, they are exploiting every type of identity, right? And that includes all types of accounts, whether it's a service account, an application account, a user account, user object. Devices have accounts as well within Active Directory. And so the way to protect them is with ITDR. It's twofold. You're going to want to reduce the identity attack surface. So from that sense, you want to remove any kind of stored account information on the endpoints, which can include task accounts, right? And then you want to hide and conceal those accounts, right? Because you can configure that within Singularity Identity, right? You want to conceal those accounts so that the attackers can't access them directly, right? And then that's the whole idea behind the ITDR solution, right? So as you look at it, you have to understand accounts are identity objects or identity data, and you can protect them with a dual-pronged approach for identity security, which is reduce the attack surface and detect identity-based attacks.
Okay. All right. Super. Now, there was some interest in the deception aspect of your talk. Gary's got a question here. Are there any precautions to use in deception that could come back to bite you logistically or legally?
So when we talk about deception, and we've looked at this, I came from a cable network, so we've done a lot when it comes to deception, and that question has come up several times. Here's the thing about deception. One, it's inside your network, so it is considered a defensive tactic. It is not doing anything outside of your network, so it does not fall under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, the CFAA. So from that aspect, legally, you're perfectly fine. It is a defensive function. Legally, you do not have to inform your users of every deception tactic you use, right? From a legal standpoint, it's perfectly fine. There are some organizations that will actually tell their users they're using deception because it limits insider threat issues. But there are many others that will not even talk about the deception solutions they have in place. They keep it completely quiet. Because here's the thing, deceptions and decoys aren't part of the operational environment. There is no legitimate reason anyone should be accessing them in the first place. So a user that is accessing a decoy, and they're hidden from regular operations. So a user accessing a decoy has found it some way, whether they've run a scan or stolen a credential that points to it. Both of those are insider threat activities. They are not legitimate user activities, and so that falls under the purview of your cybersecurity program. Legally, you're perfectly fine. And operationally, because they're hidden from your regular user staff, they should never touch your deceptive user environment.
Okay. All right. Great question, Gary. Thanks for that. And appreciate the answer, Joseph. Makes a lot of sense. Next one here, they're asking, isn't MFA enough to stop most identity-based attacks?
Yes, it is. Here's the problem. MFA is great, but there are MFA bypass techniques, right, for poorly implemented versions of MFA, particularly those that don't follow FIDO2 or FIDO. And MFA adoption is not very high, right? According to the Identity Security Alliance, MFA adoption sits at somewhere less than 20%. So it's an issue, especially if you're one of those users that can't, or one of those organizations that hasn't deployed MFA, right? So yes, MFA is absolutely great. It will stop just about every identity-based attack if it's being used. And remember how I mentioned deactivating MFA? That was actually a live readout during an assessment we ran with Ranger AD during a webinar where we ran a live assessment. The person who had done the assessment, the organization, had gone through an audit and didn't think we'd find anything. We found 27 different things. And one of the findings they had was a particular site had deactivated MFA because it was too cumbersome for their users to use. So MFA, while great, problem is adoption, and there are MFA bypass techniques.
Yeah, the statistic you mentioned is surprising to me, how low the adoption of MFA is.
Yeah, it's something like 22.5% of enterprises are actually using MFA.
Wow. Okay.
Internally.
Right. Here's another question on deception and concealing. You mentioned concealing privileged identity data. How can you ensure that only the right people can see or access the hidden data?
So the cool part about at least our technology is that when we conceal, we're looking at it from the user and application, right? So and we do it by whitelisting, right? It's not blacklisting because you can get around blacklist. It's whitelisting. This specific user or this specific group can only use these applications that are authorized. So, for example, an attacker will install something like Bloodhound. Bloodhound was an application that was put out during DEF CON, I believe it was 22. In a talk called 6 Degrees to Domain Admin. And what it does is it graphs users and permissions, privileges, relationships between users and groups to identify domain admins and the shortest path that you need to take to get to those domain admins. We can blacklist, we can keep it so that Bloodhound is only whitelisted for 1 or 2 specific users, and anyone else that tries to use Bloodhound automatically gets decoy information. Yes, we can provide decoy information to Bloodhound. So we'll provide only the right information to the right users using the right applications. Everyone else gets decoys.
Huh. Probably have time for just a couple more. Here's one about, you talked a lot about Active Directory. They're wondering, it's hard to fix all the problems we find in AD audits. How can you make it easier?
Well, that's where Ranger AD really shines, right? So as I mentioned, Ranger AD has 2 ways to help you remediate. It has a remediation scripting engine because there are some exposures that you can remediate automatically. And this remediation scripting engine can remediate those exposures with a rollback feature in case something happens, or you realize that you did a remediation you weren't supposed to, and you can roll it back. The other way is that we provide full reference for every exposure, all 135 different exposures. We provide full reference, including the manual remediation steps that you would have to take to remediate the exposure. So your AD admins no longer have to figure out what the hell is the admin SD holder ACL and how do I fix that issue. We tell you how to do it. We can even automatically remediate things like that Kerberos ticket granting ticket. Oh, I'm sorry, no, that one requires manual remediation. There's certain, like I said, there's certain remediations we can do, like users with excess replication permissions, which leave you open to a DC sync or a DC shadow attack, and that we can remove those users automatically. So we help those two ways. We can do automatic remediation with rollback, and we provide all of the remediation steps if you need to do it manually.
Okay. Well, it looks like we're just about up on time. Joseph, if somebody wants to get started with SentinelOne or find out more, what do you recommend for next steps?
Go to our website. We have a lot of information on all of our technologies, including our identity suite. We have signups for demos if you want someone to contact you. We are even doing a trial Ranger AD assessment for those of you who may want to try that out. We'll do a readout and do an actual assessment in your live environment and talk about a few high-level things and then show you all of the rest of the things that you would get if you actually subscribe to that function. So there's several different ways to do that.
Okay, super. Yeah, and a quick reminder to everybody about those handouts. As we are about to end, it's a good time to grab those if you're interested. For example, I just hit the identity security checklist download button because I wanted to grab that for myself. But Joseph, thank you so much for putting together a really informative presentation here and for all your insights in the Q&A. Really appreciate your time today, and thanks for the update.
Thank you very much.
All right, and before we wrap up, we have one more piece of business. It's the Amazon gift card prize drawing, and the winner of that $300 Amazon gift card today is Jessica Taylor from Tennessee. So congratulations to Jessica. We'll be in touch to get you your card. And with that, on behalf of the Actual Tech Media team, I want to thank SentinelOne for making this event possible. And thanks as always for attending and for all of your great questions today. That concludes this event. Have a fantastic rest of your day.